I want to go a bit wider than academic publications. Beat asked me to explore some of the work that we have done on communicating with wider publics. I'm Donald Bruce, and I've been coming to ClinEm since about the third one to talk about ethics. I'm originally a scientist. Way back, I was in the nuclear industry, but I switched into ethics about 20 or 30 years ago, originally working for the Church of Scotland and most recently running my own company. And one of the things that I've been doing is to produce a card game called Democs for public discussion. And I want to sort of explain why one was doing that. Here is a photograph of what is now called the Queensferry Crossing, the bridge across the Firth of Forth, the estuary of the River Forth outside Edinburgh, when it was being constructed some years ago. And as you see, there's a hole in the middle. And the question is, that is representing the gap between where you are as scientists and where the general public is in terms of what it hears about. And science communication has some significant limits, because we've just been talking about academic papers, but all of these have a very limited specialist audience. The people who are actually within that field are usually the only people who get to hear about it. And if you want to go wider than that, well, I'm actually a member of the government's animal research committee called Animals and Science for the UK government. And within like all European countries and also the UK, have to do a lay summary of any research project that has been approved. And I have spent a lot of time trying to get scientists to write lay summaries actually in understandable language. And it's proved very, very difficult, because this isn't part of your average scientist's mainstream work. And they often don't get much credit for public communication work. So this is a useful way of doing things, but not often very well used. Institutions can have websites, and that can be very effective in telling you about the research they're doing, and it can be a very good method of getting to a lot of people, provided you actually read the website. But again, you have a limited audience. Popular science journals are a real step forward in bridging the gap. Things like the New Scientist, Scientific American, and so forth. But usually, they're only speaking to a scientifically literate audience. So again, in terms of the general population, you're still quite limited. To reach a wider population, you go to the mainstream media. But here, this scientific work that you've been doing is taken out of your hands and put into the hands of the media. And the media have a whole set of different framings of what it is you've done, because they are interested in selling newspapers or getting how many people have been watching your television program or whatever it is. And that causes quite a different effect on what's important and what isn't. There are a number of sort of problems immediately. You get people writing headlines that don't necessarily resemble the story. We did a lot of work on the ethics of cloning issues. I knew the people at Roslin who were doing the work very well, and we produced some ethical comments at the time. When Ian Wilmot, who led the team, was called before the government's committee on science and technology, he was asked, how long before you think you would get human cloning? And Ian said, no, you've got the wrong story. This is about animal cloning. And he said, no, answer the question, how long? And he said, well, I suppose you can make some progress in 2 years, but really, I mean, it's not the way we're going. All the major mainstream broadsheet newspapers produce the same headline, human cloning in 2 years, says scientist. He never said it. But that's the problem, because the headline writer is not interested in accurate science, but getting somebody to read the newspaper. There's also the tendency to sensationalize an issue, and this can be either positive or negative. It can be, wow, gee whiz, or terrible scandal. And also, there is a tendency within the media to polarize the issue into pro and against. So on climate change issues, you have to talk to the climate deniers, even though they're such a tiny proportion of the scientific community. So you have problems like this. Once you put yourself into the hands of the media, almost anything can happen. There's also a tendency for being self-referential. They tend to wish to use their own terminology and to refer back to it, or else refer to a media personality that you've seen in order to kind of somehow root this in the general population. I've done a great deal of work with the media over the years, and this is just from my personal experience. You can get a really good documentary if you're lucky enough to be someone who has got a discovery that is really taken forward and is of general interest in the media. But you are still subject to the angle that the producer decides to put on the programme. And again, that can skew things quite significantly. Another thing which actually the cloning story came up with was actually the tendency of the film media to actually come out with all kinds of fiction, basically, which are hugely influential on people's views about Frankenstein food, or Frankenstein at all, the boys from Brazil and cloning, and Gattaca about human genetics. Social media, well, if misinformation going viral is my comment about that, highly unreliable. And the problem is, at the end of the day, what becomes the received story may not actually be the true story. So if I asked you, what did Dolly the sheep die of? I suspect many of you would have said, well, possibly shortened lifespan or something like this. She actually caught a lung disease from a fellow sheep and died of it prematurely. Hardly anybody knows that. But the stories out there are quite different. Anyway, that's a little bit about, oh, and of course you've got the problem of how do you communicate with people for whom, if you're having GM food, you're eating genes, which you wouldn't have done if you were just eating an ordinary tomato. You have misconceptions in the population. So this is linear communication, and that's one of the problems, because most people actually want to understand things in discussion. There were, in the days of genetically modified food, people were saying, we must educate the public, and they will all roll over and say GM food is wonderful, without taking account of people's value perspectives. And this rebounded back, and in Europe particularly, the whole idea of this deficit model of understanding, the public are in deficit, we must fill the deficit up, totally discredited. And what's replaced it is the idea of upstream engagement. We must engage the publics early. This became the big thing which was done, and nanotechnology was the first new technology to actually be subject to this treatment. And there were many engagement initiatives, which I was involved with, one or two. The problem is that the focus groups don't actually reach many people, and they're in a rather artificial situation. And in the case of nano, people found this rather hard to grasp. It was too new, a bit scary, and there were worries about commercialization. But you could have said that anyway. There were very few new insights about nanotechnology when we did that study. The one thing that did seem to work was if you had an application-specific study. So, for example, the Engineering and Science Research Council put on a question about, in nanomedicine, what would you put money into? And one of the questions was, should you put it into theranostics? And one of the answers that came back from publics was actually, I'm not so sure about having a device in my body which both works out whether I've got something and treats me at the same time. Talking to the industry, in that some years back, the same fear of, I'm not quite sure we can really rely on this. The scientists were gung-ho for this combining the two. Publics were a lot less appreciative. They want some control of my own. So you can get good feedback if you have a specific enough engagement. And the EC had developed a concept called responsible research and innovation, trying to gather this together. Well, that is the question that I've addressed from a broad perspective, but we are asking a question, could we find a more deliberative way to engage publics? And a man called Perry Walker devised a thing called the Democs card game. Deliberative Meetings of Citizens was where the title comes from. It started off in 2001 with a game on stem cells, which I was involved with the production of. And it's since been used in a very wide range of issues, from cloning to climate change. The game is actually not a true statement. It's actually a semi-structured group discussion with cards as the medium. That's rather a mouthful, so we call it a game. It needs 6 to 8 people, and they have a set of cards being pre-written on a particular subject, and the group makes selections using the range of cards, and the outputs are to make group statements, and also individuals can vote on applications. And you're invited, if they want to give their reasons why they voted the way they did. It's a free boxed kit, and over there I have got 3 copies of one we did on nanomedicine, particularly focusing on atherosclerosis, and one in English, one in German, and one in French, and I'd be very pleased if you would take them away, because I don't want to carry them back with me. We're working on a possible online version of this at the moment, but it could be quite tricky. But the idea here is you're finding natural groups of people in the population. They're discussing without having to have an expert present, because the cards are the expert. Its effectiveness depends on how many games you play, and that's a problem, that's one of the weaknesses of the game. The NanoAthero project, which began in Clinam, used one of these games as part of its work, which I was involved with. And this is the idea of nanoparticle systems to transport and target contrast agents and therapeutics to try and predict clots and unstable plaques in advance of the symptoms. And we did we produced a game on this, and that is the result of it. And the idea is having it in your own language was because it's much better to play in your own mother tongue than in a strange language, which is your second or third language. Here's an example of some of the cards we used. So here we start off with what we call story cards, which have got typical people involved with the technology or affected by it. So here is a heart patient who says, well, I got no warning of the heart attack, it just this terrible pain and I blacked out. And he's talking about how he learned it was atherosclerosis, and he's said, I'm lucky to survive. But the doctor says, would you be willing to take part in the trial with nanoparticles to see if they can detect the plaque building up in my arteries? And they said, well, it's a risk, it might not work for me. The particles might end up somewhere strange, but should I do it? So people like me don't suffer in future. So the idea is you tell a typical story, and you ask at the end a dilemma. So we've got a heart patient, a carer for a stroke victim, a CEO of a startup company who is running into financial problems, a heart surgeon, and an ethics committee as examples of this. That's the first title. You all just read out these to each other in the group. Then you have 2 series of cards. One is called information cards, the green ones, and one called issue cards, the blue ones. And these are just short cards with something to do with the basic information you need to know to think about the issue in the green, or some of the issues that might be raised. And whereas in the green ones we're hopeful that they're all accurate, the blue ones will be different opinions, and some of them may even be literally opposite to each other. And the idea is you discuss these amongst yourselves, and you come up eventually with some conclusions which you'd like to draw. Also, there are some questions we then put to people. So, for example, what applications would you use nanotechnology for? So, for example, in imaging atherosclerosis, number 2. And you're asked, is this acceptable? Yes, possibly, don't know, doubtful, no. And why, in your own words? And likewise, we ask some questions about, so for example, animal testing. In nanomedicine, it's essential to use animals to test the efficacy and safety of new nanomedicines before we trial them in humans. Do you agree? And so forth. So with these sorts of questions, one gets a feel for how people respond. Now, one point about this is that it is not statistically significant, because a group could be a group of anybody, people. If you play enough games, you have a chance to actually get sufficient variation. But on the numbers of games we actually played, a few points that came out. Would you agree that the risks outweigh the benefits? That's the middle one, right just below the black line. And the biggest answer was, I don't know, because I don't have the information to actually answer a question like that. Next one down, animal testing and medicine is essential. Most people say yes. And taking part in clinical trials is important. Few less people said yes. I want to know the probability of future serious diseases. A very much more mixed response came out of that. So although I wouldn't call these statistically significant, nonetheless, it begins to give you some ideas about how people think about these issues. So, finishing off, Democs is discussion in natural groups without an expert present. It's global commons, it's free to everybody. The games work very well with ordinary members of the public, less effective if you're an activist or a stakeholder with a strong view. Very effective, actually, in postgrad teaching on ethical issues. It's a very good interactive tool. As a tool for reaching the population, its restriction is just simply finding enough people to play it. And therefore, it has its restrictions. As I've said before, it's only indicative of the views of the people who played it, so you can't make statistical samples unless you play enough games. But it does raise another question, is you've got 2 hours to play this game, or less than that perhaps, and you're asked to come up with a conclusion. Actually, if you're facing a new question, it will take you weeks or months to come to a conclusion. And so science discussion takes time, is my final message. Thank you.